On the morning of December the 25th in the year 800, within the vast and dimly lit interior of the basilica that Christians called Old St. Peter's, the cold air of a Roman winter mingled with the smoke of countless candles and the heavy fragrance of incense drifting upward toward the ancient timbered roof. The great church standing upon the hill where tradition held that the Apostle Peter had been buried more than 7 centuries earlier was filled that day with an assembly of clergy, nobles, and common Roman citizens whose collective breath rose visibly in the chill beneath the vaulted spaces. At the centre of this gathering knelt a man of extraordinary physical stature, a Frankish king past his middle years, whose reputation for military conquest had spread across the whole of Western Christendom, and who had come to the city of Rome not as a pilgrim seeking blessing, but as a judge sent to restore order to a papacy that had nearly been destroyed by violence. The king wore, on this particular occasion, the long tunic and the great mantle of a Roman patrician, rather than the simple Frankish dress he preferred in his northern homeland, a concession to the solemnity of the setting and to the ancient traditions of the city, whose name still carried the weight of imperial memory. As Charles, King of the Franks and of the Lombards, rose from his position of prayer before the confession of St. Peter, Pope Leo III stepped forward, bearing in his hands a crown of gold, and in a single gesture that would echo across more than 1,000 years of European history, the pontiff lowered that golden circlet onto the head of the kneeling monarch. The assembled congregation, apparently prepared for precisely this moment, lifted their voices in a great acclamation that filled the enormous space, proclaiming Charles Augustus crowned by God, the great and peace-giving emperor of the Romans, and wishing him life and victory in the ancient formula that had once greeted the Caesars of a vanished world. The words that rang through Old St. Peter's that Christmas morning carried an almost unbearable weight of implication, because for more than 300 years no man in the Latin West had borne the title of Roman Emperor, the imperial dignity having survived only in the distant Greek-speaking court of Constantinople after the collapse of Roman authority in Italy during the 5th century. The acclamation of Charles as emperor was therefore not merely the elevation of one powerful ruler above others, but the deliberate resurrection of an office and an idea that many had believed extinguished forever, the revival of the Western Roman Empire in the person of a Germanic warlord whose ancestors had once been counted among the barbarian peoples who had overwhelmed the frontiers of Rome. The chronicle known as the Annals of Lorsch recorded that the assembly hailed him with those very words, "To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and pacific emperor of the Romans, life and victory," and in recording them the annalists preserved the precise formula through which an old world was declared reborn. The question that emerges from that frozen moment beneath the candlelit vaults of the basilica is one that has occupied historians and chroniclers from that day to the present, and it is a question that resists any simple answer. How was it that a man who could barely read, who had never in his long life mastered the physical act of writing despite his evident hunger for the learning of the ancient world, who had been raised among the horse-riding warrior aristocracy of a people the Romans had once dismissed as savage, came to be crowned as the direct heir of Caesar and of Constantine, the successor to the emperors who had ruled the Mediterranean world and given their laws to half of humanity? How did the son of a usurping Frankish official, a man whose family had seized the throne of the Franks by force and required the sanction of the church to legitimize what the sword had won, ascend to a dignity that placed him, at least in the imagination of the Latin West, above every other monarch in Christendom and made him the earthly guardian of the Christian faith itself? There is, moreover, a genuine historical disagreement concerning the events of that morning, a disagreement that reaches back to the sources closest to Charles himself. His devoted biographer Einhard, writing some years after the emperor's death, insisted that Charles had been taken by surprise, claiming that the king afterward declared he would never have entered the church on that day, despite it being so great a feast, had he known in advance what the Pope intended to do. Yet many modern historians have looked upon that account with considerable scepticism, arguing that a ceremony of such elaborate construction, requiring the presence of the assembled clergy and citizens, the preparation of the crown, and the coordination of the carefully worded acclamation, could hardly have been arranged in secret and sprung upon an unwilling king. The most probable truth is that the coronation represented a negotiation of interests between a pope who owed his very restoration to Frankish arms, and a king who understood the immense authority that the imperial title would confer, though the precise degree of Charles's foreknowledge and consent may never be recovered from the fragmentary evidence that survives. To understand how such a coronation became possible, and to comprehend the man upon whose head that golden crown descended, it is necessary to travel backward across the whole span of his life, and beyond it into the world that produced him, into the fractured and violent landscape of the post-Roman West, where the very idea of empire had become a fading memory preserved only in crumbling monuments and the yellowing pages of a few surviving manuscripts. This is the story of Charles the Great, whom later ages would know by the Latinized name of Carolus Magnus, and whom the French tongue would render as Charlemagne, from the contested circumstances of his birth around the middle of the 8th century, through the partition and reunification of the Frankish kingdom he inherited, through the long and terrible wars he waged against the pagan Saxons, and the campaigns that carried Frankish arms against the Lombards of Italy, the Avars of the Danube, and the Muslim rulers of Spain, to the extraordinary court of learning he assembled at Aachen, and the imperial dignity he assumed in the Basilica of St. Peter, until his death in that same northern capital in the year 814. It is the account of how a barely literate soldier-king reforged, however imperfectly and however briefly, the vision of a united and Christian Roman world in the wreckage that the fall of the ancient empire had left behind. The world into which Charles was born had been shaped by the long and gradual dissolution of Roman authority in Western Europe, a process that had unfolded across the 2.5 centuries preceding his birth, and that had left the former provinces of the empire divided among a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms, whose rulers governed populations still partly Roman in culture and language, while imposing upon them the customs and military traditions of the conquering peoples. Among these successor states, the kingdom of the Franks had emerged as the most durable and the most powerful, occupying the territories of ancient Gaul and extending eastward across the Rhine into lands the Romans had never fully subdued. The Frankish realm had been ruled since the late 5th century by the dynasty of the Merovingians, descendants of the legendary Merovech and of Clovis, the king who had united the Frankish tribes and adopted the Catholic form of Christianity, thereby securing for his people the goodwill of the Roman clergy and the Latin-speaking population of Gaul. By the middle of the 8th century, however, the Merovingian dynasty had sunk into a condition of profound weakness and political irrelevance, its kings reduced to figures of ceremony who reigned in name while exercising almost no genuine authority over the affairs of their kingdom. Einhard, in the biography he composed of Charles, preserved a memorable and deliberately unflattering portrait of these later Merovingian rulers, describing them as men who possessed nothing beyond the empty and vain title of king, whose long hair and flowing beards marked them out as royalty, while real power had passed entirely into other hands. According to this account, such a king would sit upon the throne on ceremonial occasions and play at the part of ruler, receiving foreign ambassadors and giving them the answers he had been instructed to deliver as though the words were his own, while in truth he governed nothing and possessed nothing except a single estate that yielded him a modest income. When he needed to travel, he was conveyed in an ox cart driven by a rustic herdsman in the ancient manner, a spectacle of impotence that the biographer contrasted sharply with the vigour of the men who had come to hold actual power in the kingdom. Those men were the mayors of the palace, officials who had originally served as the chief administrators of the royal household, but who had, over the course of several generations, accumulated to themselves the substance of royal authority, while leaving the Merovingian kings to enjoy the hollow shell of their inherited dignity. The office of mayor had become effectively hereditary within a single powerful family that historians would later name the Carolingians, after the many members who bore the name Charles, and it was this family that had emerged as the true rulers of the Frankish world in all but name. The mayors led the armies, dispensed justice, negotiated with foreign powers, and distributed the lands and offices upon which the loyalty of the aristocracy depended, so that the political reality of the kingdom bore almost no relation to the theoretical arrangement in which a Merovingian king sat enthroned above his subjects. The rise of the Carolingian family to this position of dominance owed a great deal to the achievements of Charles Martel, the grandfather of the future emperor, who consolidated his grip upon the office of mayor of the palace during the early decades of the 8th century, and made himself the master of the Frankish realm through a combination of military skill and ruthless political calculation. Charles Martel earned his enduring reputation above all through a single celebrated engagement that took place near the cities of Tours and Poitiers in central Gaul on the 10th day of October in the year 732, when a Frankish army under his command confronted and defeated a raiding force of Umayyad Muslims who had crossed the Pyrenees from the Iberian Peninsula, which their coreligionists had conquered from the Visigoths some 2 decades earlier. Though certain modern historians have questioned whether this battle possessed the decisive strategic significance that later tradition assigned to it, arguing that the Muslim force may have constituted a raiding expedition rather than a campaign of conquest, and that its defeat did not by itself determine the fate of Western Europe, the victory nonetheless cemented the reputation of Charles Martel as the great defender of Christendom against the advance of Islam, and lent an aura of divinely sanctioned success to the ascending Carolingian house. The son and heir of Charles Martel was Pepin, called the Short on account of his stature, and it was Pepin who took the momentous step of transforming the de facto power of the Carolingians into the recognised and hallowed authority of kingship. Pepin had inherited from his father the substance of royal power without the title, and he possessed the ambition and the political acumen to recognise that force alone could not confer the sacred legitimacy that a true king required in the eyes of the Church and of the Frankish people. The mayors of the palace ruled because they were strong, but strength was a precarious foundation for authority, subject to challenge by any rival who might prove stronger, and Pepin sought to place his family's dominion upon a footing that no mere warlord could easily overturn. To this end he turned to the highest spiritual authority in the Latin West, the Bishop of Rome, seeking from the papacy a sanction that would clothe his usurpation in the garment of holiness. In the year 751, Pepin obtained from Pope Zachary a ruling upon the fundamental question of who ought to hold the title of king, and the Pope, weighing the matter, is reported to have declared that it was better that the man who actually held power should be called king than the one who possessed only the empty name. Armed with this papal sanction, Pepin moved to depose the last of the Merovingian rulers, a king named Childeric III, whose fate illustrated with brutal clarity the symbolic dimensions of Frankish kingship. Childeric was subjected to the ritual of tonsure, the ceremonial cutting of his long hair, which among the Merovingians had served as the very emblem of royal blood and sacred prerogative, so that the shearing of those locks amounted to a public unmaking of his kingship, and a stripping away of the dignity that his ancestors had borne for nearly 3 centuries. His hair thus shorn, the deposed king was confined to a monastery to live out his remaining years in obscurity, and with him the dynasty of the long-haired kings passed forever from the stage of history. The elevation of Pepin to the throne was sealed not merely by the removal of his predecessor, but by a positive act of religious consecration that would prove of the greatest significance for the future of his dynasty, and for the whole subsequent history of European kingship. Pepin was anointed with holy oil in the manner of the kings of ancient Israel described in the Hebrew Scriptures, a ritual that transformed him from a mere ruler chosen by men into a monarch set apart and sanctified by the grace of God, ruling by divine favour rather than by human contrivance alone. This anointing established a sacred foundation for Carolingian kingship, but it also created a profound and lasting dependence, for the family that owed its royal legitimacy to the sanction and blessing of the Church would ever afterward be bound to the papacy in a relationship of mutual obligation, the kings serving as the protectors and defenders of Rome, and the popes furnishing the spiritual authority that hallowed the Frankish crown. The dynasty that would soon produce Charles the Great had thus secured its throne by force, but required holy legitimacy to hold it, and this fundamental fact would shape the destiny of the family, and ultimately draw its greatest son toward the coronation in Old St. Peter's that lay half a century in the future. Into this dynasty, at the moment of its transformation from mayoralty to kingship, Charles the future emperor was born, the son of Pepin the Short, and of his wife Bertrada, who came from the region of Laon in the Frankish heartland, and who would remain a figure of considerable influence in her son's life for many years. The precise year of Charles's birth remains a matter of genuine uncertainty among scholars, for the sources that describe his life were composed decades after the event and do not agree with perfect consistency, and while some older traditions placed his birth in the year 742, much modern scholarship has inclined toward a date around 747 or 748, some years after the traditional reckoning. The 2nd day of April was preserved by tradition as the date of his birth within whatever year it fell, and this uncertainty concerning even so basic a fact as the year of his coming into the world serves as a reminder of how sparse and imperfect the surviving records of the 8th century can be, even for a man who had become the most celebrated ruler of his age. Whatever the exact year of his birth, Charles entered the world at a moment of extraordinary consequence for his family, for his infancy or early childhood coincided with the events that raised the Carolingians from the ambiguous status of mayors to the sacred dignity of kingship. The alliance between the Frankish monarchy and the papacy that Pepin had inaugurated was given further and more elaborate confirmation in the year 754, when Pope Stephen II, the successor of Zachary, journeyed across the Alps into the Frankish kingdom seeking military assistance against the Lombards, who threatened the territories of the Roman Church in Italy. At the ancient basilica of Saint-Denis near Paris, the burial place of the patron saint of the Franks, Pope Stephen performed a solemn ceremony of anointing in the month of July, consecrating Pepin anew as king of the Franks, and bestowing upon him and upon his heirs the additional dignity of Patrician of the Romans, a title that bound the Frankish royal house still more tightly to the fate of Rome and its church. In that same ceremony at Saint-Denis, the Pope extended his anointing beyond the person of Pepin himself to encompass the king's 2 young sons, Charles and his younger brother Charlemagne, so that the boys who would inherit the kingdom were themselves marked out with holy oil and set apart for future rule while still children. This act of anointing the heirs alongside their father served to entrench the sacred character of Carolingian kingship within the very bloodline of the family, ensuring that the sanctity Pepin had acquired would pass to his descendants, and that the alliance between Frank and papacy would endure beyond the lifetime of any single ruler. For the young Charles, to be anointed as a boy at Saint-Denis was to be enrolled from his earliest years in the great compact between his dynasty and the church, a compact that would define the entire trajectory of his life and lead him at last to the imperial coronation in Rome. Charles grew to manhood within the culture of a warrior aristocracy, for whom skill in arms, prowess on horseback, and the endurance of the hunt and the campaign constituted the essential virtues of a nobleman, and he was groomed from his youth for the demands of leadership in a world where a king was expected above all to lead his men in battle, and to secure by force the loyalty and the plunder that bound the aristocracy to his service. His education in the arts of war was furnished in large measure by his father's campaigns, and in particular by the long and grueling struggle that Pepin waged to subdue the region of Aquitaine in the southwest of Gaul, a war of many years that hardened the young Charles to the rigours of military life and taught him the patient, methodical persistence that campaigns of conquest demanded. In these Aquitanian wars, the future emperor learned the arts of siege and manoeuvre, the management of armies across difficult country, and the ruthless determination required to break the resistance of a stubborn foe, lessons that he would apply on a far grander scale in the wars of his own reign. Yet if Charles was thoroughly a product of the sword, formed in the harsh school of a warrior nobility, he was also a product of the altar, shaped by the deep religiosity of his family and its intimate connection to the church, and he possessed alongside his martial vigour a genuine and lifelong hunger for the learning of the ancient world that set him apart from most rulers of his violent age. It is one of the enduring paradoxes of his character that this man who had become the great patron of scholarship and the founder of a revival of learning never himself succeeded in mastering the physical craft of writing. For although he applied himself to the effort even in his later years, keeping wax tablets and sheets of parchment beneath the pillows of his bed so that he might practice forming letters in his idle moments, as Einhard recorded, he had begun the attempt too late in life, and his large hands, so accustomed to the sword and the reins, could not readily be trained to the delicate work of the pen. This failure to acquire the skill of writing did not, however, diminish his reverence for the written word or his appetite for knowledge, and in time he would gather about himself the finest scholars of the age, and set in motion a renewal of intellectual life whose effects would long outlast his empire. The Charles who emerged from this upbringing was thus a figure forged from the union of two great forces that dominated the 8th century Frankish world: the tradition of the mounted warrior and the tradition of the Christian church, the sword and the altar joined together in a single ambitious and formidable personality. He had been anointed as a child and enrolled in his family's sacred compact with Rome, trained in the hard realities of war by his father's Aquitanian campaigns, and raised to expect a share in the government of the Frankish realm as one of the heirs of the newly royal Carolingian house. He was prepared, in short, for a throne, though the throne he would eventually occupy was one he would have to secure and expand through his own strength and cunning, for the death of his father in the year 768 would bring not the peaceful inheritance of a united kingdom but a divided realm shared uneasily with a brother whose relationship with Charles would prove fraught with rivalry and suspicion, and whose death only 3 years later would leave the whole of the Frankish inheritance in the hands of a single ambitious young king. The death of Pepin the Short at the Abbey of Saint-Denis on the 24th day of September in the year 768 set in motion a process of division that reflected the deep-rooted customs of the Frankish peoples, for whom a kingdom was regarded not as an indivisible institution to be transmitted whole to a single heir, but rather as a form of property to be apportioned among the sons of a deceased ruler according to their birthright. This tradition of partible inheritance, which treated the realm as a patrimony to be shared rather than a crown to be singularly worn, stood in marked contrast to the practices of later medieval monarchies, and it introduced into the Frankish political order a persistent instability that had repeatedly threatened to shatter the unity of the kingdom in the generations before Charles. The old king, understanding the demands of custom and perhaps hoping to forestall the very conflict he could not prevent, arranged for his 2 surviving sons to succeed him jointly, dividing between Charles and his younger brother Charlemagne the whole of the territories over which he had ruled. The partition that resulted was a curious and awkward one, designed less to grant each brother a coherent and defensible domain than to distribute the wealth and the strategic advantages of the realm in a manner that would prevent either from gaining an overwhelming preponderance over the other, and its geographical arrangement bore within it the seeds of the friction that would soon arise. Charles, the elder of the two, received a crescent of territories that swept along the outer edges of the Frankish world, encompassing the ancient heartland of Austrasia in the northeast, together with substantial portions of the southwestern region of Aquitaine, so that his lands formed an arc that curved around the more compact and central holdings assigned to his brother. Carloman, for his part, was granted a solid block of territory in the interior of the kingdom, comprising the fertile and populous basin of Paris, the rich lands of Burgundy, the Mediterranean province of Provence in the south, and portions of the region of Alemannia in the east, so that the younger brother controlled a more consolidated and in many respects more prosperous domain than the elder. The division of Aquitaine between the two of them was particularly fraught with difficulty, for this restive southwestern region had only recently been subdued through the long and exhausting campaigns of their father Pepin, and its fractured allegiance to 2 separate masters created immediate opportunities for renewed rebellion among a population that had never fully reconciled itself to Frankish domination, The arrangement thus placed the brothers in a position of uneasy proximity, each ruling from his own separate court, surrounded by his own body of advisors and magnates, and each regarding the other across their shared frontiers with a suspicion that would rapidly harden into open hostility. The Cold War that developed between the two young kings in the months following their father's death revealed the profound and dangerous fragility of the divided Frankish realm, and it demonstrated how swiftly the ambitions of rival rulers could threaten to undo the painstaking work of consolidation that the Carolingian house had accomplished over the preceding decades. The friction between the brothers reached its first serious crisis in the year 769, when the smouldering discontent of Aquitaine erupted into open rebellion under the leadership of a regional aristocrat who sought to exploit the divided authority of the two kings and to reclaim the independence that his people had lost. Charles, whose portion of the realm included the affected territories and who bore the primary responsibility for suppressing the revolt, mustered his forces and marched southward to confront the insurrection, expecting that his brother would join him in a common effort to preserve the fruits of their father's conquests. Charlemagne, however, having initially brought his own forces to the field, abruptly withdrew them and abandoned the campaign, leaving Charles to face the rebellion unsupported and exposing the elder brother to the full burden of a war that concerned them both. This act of desertion, whatever its precise motivation, could hardly have been interpreted by Charles as anything other than a calculated attempt to undermine his position and to allow his difficulties to multiply, and it deepened the mutual distrust between the two courts to a degree that threatened to make any future cooperation impossible. Charles nonetheless prosecuted the Aquitanian War with the methodical persistence that his father's campaigns had instilled in him, and despite the abandonment by his brother, he succeeded in crushing the rebellion and reasserting Frankish authority over the troubled southwest, a victory that demonstrated both his military capability and his capacity to act decisively even in circumstances of isolation and disadvantage. The episode had lasting consequences for the relationship between the brothers, for it confirmed in the mind of each the fundamental unreliability of the other and reduced their partnership to a hollow formality, masking a genuine rivalry that grew more dangerous with every passing season. Into this atmosphere of poisonous distrust stepped their mother, the Dowager Queen Bertrada, who possessed both the authority of her position as the widow of Pepin and the mother of both kings, and the political acumen to perceive the peril into which the Frankish realm was drifting. Bertrada undertook to stabilize the fractured kingdom through a program of aggressive and far-reaching diplomacy, seeking to construct a network of alliances that would secure the position of her elder son and reduce the likelihood of a fratricidal war that might destroy everything her husband had built. The centerpiece of Bertrada's diplomatic strategy was an ambitious effort to bind the Frankish house to the powerful kingdom of the Lombards, who ruled over much of the Italian peninsula from their capital at Pavia, and who represented one of the most significant powers in the Latin West. In the year 770, the Queen Mother herself travelled southward across the Alps into Italy, undertaking the arduous journey in order to negotiate directly with the Lombard king Desiderius, and to arrange a marriage alliance that would join the two ruling dynasties. The agreement she secured provided for the marriage of Charles to a daughter of Desiderius, a princess whom later tradition would call Desiderata, and the union was intended to secure the southern flank of Charles's territories against any threat from the Lombard kingdom, while simultaneously granting the Frankish king a powerful ally against the machinations of his brother. Bertrada's diplomacy extended further still, for she sought to weave a broad web of peaceful relations that would encompass not only the Lombards, but also the ducal house of Bavaria and other powers whose goodwill might strengthen the position of her family. The strategy reflected a sophisticated understanding of the diplomatic possibilities available to the Frankish crown, and it represented a bold attempt to substitute the arts of negotiation and marriage for the destructive alternatives of civil war and armed confrontation between the brothers. The Lombard marriage alliance, however, carried within it consequences that reached far beyond the immediate relations of the two Frankish kings, for it profoundly disturbed the delicate balance of power that governed the affairs of the Italian peninsula, and it alienated the papacy in Rome, which regarded the Lombards as its most persistent and dangerous enemy. The bishops of Rome had long looked to the Frankish house as their protector against Lombard aggression, and the alliance that Bertrada had constructed threatened to reverse this relationship entirely, aligning the Franks with the very power that menaced the papal territories and depriving the papacy of the ally upon whom its security depended. The arrangement also served to isolate Charlemagne, whose own relations with the papacy had been comparatively cordial and whose position was weakened by the sudden diplomatic elevation of his brother, so that the marriage that Bertrada had intended to stabilize the realm in fact intensified the very rivalries it was meant to soothe. The alliance strained the relations between the brothers to their breaking point, and it created a situation of such complexity and danger that the future of the Frankish kingdom hung upon the outcome of a rivalry that no living observer could confidently predict. Einhard, writing long afterward in his account of the emperor's life, would record that this marriage to the Lombard princess constituted the single episode that ever strained the relations between Charles and his mother, who had so ardently championed the union, a detail that reveals both the personal cost of the diplomatic manoeuvring and the eventual disaffection that would overtake the arrangement. The rivalry between the brothers, which had grown so bitter and so dangerous that it threatened to fracture the Frankish realm into warring fragments and to destroy the accumulated achievements of 3 generations of Carolingian ambition, was brought to an abrupt and entirely unexpected conclusion by the sudden death of Charlemagne on the 4th day of December in the year 771. The younger king, who was only 20 years of age at the time of his death, expired at the villa of Samusi, and while the sources that record his passing do not speak with a single voice regarding its cause, some among them attributing it to natural illness and occasionally mentioning a severe nosebleed as the immediate agent of his demise, the timing of his death proved so extraordinarily convenient for his elder brother that it has never entirely escaped the shadow of suspicion. Whatever the truth of the matter, and no evidence has ever emerged to implicate Charles directly in his brother's death, the effect of Carloman's passing was to remove at a single stroke the rival whose existence had constrained and endangered the elder brother's ambitions, and it opened before Charles a path to sole and undivided mastery over the whole of the Frankish inheritance. The moment demanded decisive action, and Charles proved himself entirely equal to its demands, moving with a swiftness and a ruthlessness that would characterize his conduct throughout the long reign that lay ahead. Charles seized his dead brother's territories at once, ignoring entirely the inheritance rights of Carloman's young sons, who by the customs of Frankish partible succession possessed a legitimate claim to the lands their father had ruled. The rapidity of his action left no opportunity for the assembling of opposition or the organization of a rival faction on behalf of his nephews, and it demonstrated the political instincts of a man who understood that the moment of a rival's death was precisely the moment at which decisive action could accomplish what years of patient manoeuvring might never achieve. The magnates and churchmen of Carloman's realm, confronted with the accomplished fact of Charles's occupation of the territories, and offered the security and the rewards that adherence to a powerful and generous king could provide, largely acquiesced in the transfer of their allegiance, and the divided kingdom that had teetered on the edge of civil war was reunified under a single ruler with a speed that astonished contemporaries. The widow of Carloman, a woman named Gerberga, found her position rendered suddenly untenable, for she possessed neither the means to resist her brother-in-law's seizure of power, nor any assurance of safety for herself and her children, within a realm now wholly dominated by the man who had disinherited her sons. She fled, taking with her the 2 young boys who represented the surviving claim of Carloman's line, and accompanied by Carloman's chief adviser, a magnate named Aucha. She made her way southward across the Alps to seek refuge and political leverage at the Lombard court in Pavia. The flight of Gerberga to the protection of King Desiderius carried within it the potential for grave future difficulty, for it placed in the hands of the Lombard ruler a set of legitimate Frankish claimants, whose existence could be exploited to challenge the authority of Charles and to sow division within his newly reunited realm. Einhard, in his account of these events, would characterize Gerberga's departure with a pointed and revealing phrase, declaring that she fled to Italy for no reason at all, a formulation that reflected the perspective of Charles's court and that sought to portray his consolidation of power as a natural and unobjectionable process, while conveniently ignoring the very real threat that his seizure of his nephew's inheritance posed to a woman and her children. The reality, of course, was that Gerberga had every reason to fear for her position and her family's future, and her decision to seek the protection of the Lombard king was a rational response to the ruthless efficiency with which Charles had dispossessed her sons of their birthright. The consequences of the seizure and the flight would unfold over the years that followed. For Desiderius, who had already been alienated by the collapse of the marriage alliance that Bertrada had laboured to construct, now possessed in the persons of Carloman's sons a powerful instrument with which to trouble the peace of the Frankish realm and to challenge the legitimacy of its reunifier. The reunification of the Frankish kingdom under the sole authority of Charles transformed at a single stroke the political circumstances in which the young king found himself, converting a divided and unstable realm perpetually threatened by internal rivalry into a unified and formidable power base from which the ambitions of its ruler could be projected outward in every direction. The sibling rivalry that had threatened to tear the kingdom apart vanished with the death of Charlemagne, leaving behind a man now free to turn his gaze toward the horizon and toward the vast possibilities of conquest and expansion that lay open before a united Frankish state. Yet the very act by which Charles had achieved this consolidation had created for him a set of enemies who would never forget the manner of his rise, and the presence of his dispossessed nephews at the Lombard court ensured that the affairs of Italy would soon demand his attention. The collapse of the marriage alliance with Desiderius, whom Charles had by this time repudiated by sending the Lombard princess back to her father, had converted a potential ally into an aggrieved adversary, and the sheltering of Gerberga and her sons had given that adversary both a grievance and a weapon. The stage was thus set for the first of the great campaigns of conquest that would define the reign of Charles, a campaign that would carry his armies across the Alps and into the heart of the Italian peninsula, and that would end with the destruction of one of the oldest and most powerful kingdoms of the post-Roman West. The circumstances that precipitated the Frankish invasion of Italy in the year 773 arose from the convergence of several distinct sources of conflict, all of which centred upon the ambitions and the anxieties of the Lombard king Desiderius, and upon the vulnerable position of the papacy caught between the two great powers of the Latin West. Desiderius, having welcomed Gerberga and the sons of Carloman to his court, sought to employ these Frankish heirs as instruments with which to challenge the legitimacy of Charles, and he pressed the papacy to recognise the boys as the rightful kings of the Franks, an act that would have cast doubt upon the entire basis of Charles's authority and provided a rallying point for any who might wish to oppose him. At the same time, the Lombard king pursued his own territorial ambitions within Italy, with an aggression that directly threatened the security of the papal state, invading the territories over which the Bishop of Rome claimed authority, and seizing the region known as the Duchy of the Pentapolis, a strip of territory along the Adriatic coast, whose loss would have gravely weakened the papacy's position. The pope who confronted these dangers was Hadrian I, a determined and capable pontiff who had ascended to the throne of St. Peter in the year 772, and who moved swiftly to resist the encroachments of the Lombard king, expelling from the Roman Curia those officials who had served the interests of Desiderius, and refusing to yield to the pressure exerted upon him. When his efforts to resist Desiderius by his own means proved insufficient against the military superiority of the Lombard kingdom, Pope Hadrian turned, as his predecessors had turned before him, to the Frankish crown for protection, appealing to Charles to fulfil the ancient obligation that bound the Carolingian house to the defence of the Church of Rome. The appeal placed before Charles an opportunity of immense significance, for it offered him the chance to intervene in Italian affairs as the champion of the papacy and the defender of the faith, to eliminate the threat posed by his dispossessed nephews and their Lombard protector, and to extend his power southward across the Alps into one of the wealthiest and most storied regions of the former Roman world. Charles, having exhausted the possibilities of negotiation and finding Desiderius unwilling to yield either the disputed territories or the persons of Carloman's sons, resolved upon war and in the year 773 he mustered his forces at Geneva in preparation for the crossing of the Alps into Italy. The chroniclers who recorded the failure of the preliminary negotiations observed of the Lombard king's obstinacy that neither by prayers nor by gifts did Charles avail to bend the most ferocious heart, a formulation that placed the responsibility for the ensuing war upon the intransigence of Desiderius, and that justified the Frankish invasion as the reluctant recourse of a king whose peaceful overtures had been rejected. The campaign that followed demonstrated the strategic sophistication that Charles brought to the conduct of war, for rather than committing his entire force to a single perilous crossing of the mountain barrier that separated Gaul from Italy, he divided his army into two contingents and directed them along separate routes through the Alpine passes, so as to divide the attention of the Lombard defenders and to increase the likelihood that at least one force would succeed in breaking through into the plains beyond. One contingent, placed under the command of his uncle Bernard, was directed to cross the Alps by way of the Great St. Bernard Pass, while Charles himself led the main body of the army over the pass of Montseny, and the two forces were intended to converge upon the interior of the Lombard kingdom once they had descended from the mountains. The Lombard defenders, who had established fortified positions to contest the passage of the Frankish armies, were unable to withstand the assault, and after the Franks had routed the forces arrayed against them near the town of Susa, at the foot of the Alps, the path into the Italian plain lay open before them. The two contingents converged upon the Lombard capital of Pavia, before whose walls the main force of Charles arrived in the month of October in the year 773, and there the decisive phase of the campaign would be fought not in the clash of armies upon the open field, but in the long and grinding endurance of a siege. The siege of Pavia, which began in the autumn of 773, and endured through the whole of the following winter and spring until the summer of 774, tested the patience and the logistical capacity of the Frankish army against the formidable defences of a great fortified city, and it demonstrated the methodical persistence that Charles had learned in the Aquitanian campaigns of his father. Rather than attempting to storm the walls by direct assault, which would have cost his army dearly against the strong fortifications of the Lombard capital, Charles resolved to reduce the city through blockade and starvation, constructing earthworks and establishing a comprehensive cordon around Pavia that cut off its defenders from any relief or resupply. Throughout the long months of the siege, the population of the city and the garrison that held it suffered increasingly from the effects of hunger and from the diseases that inevitably accompanied the confinement of a besieged population, while the Frankish army maintained its grip upon the city and awaited the inevitable exhaustion of its defenders. By the month of June in the year 774, the combined pressures of famine and disease had rendered further resistance impossible, and King Desiderius, whose fierce and obstinate spirit had refused every earlier overture, was at last compelled to surrender himself and his capital to the Frankish king. The deposed Lombard monarch was removed from the throne he had occupied, and was sent into confinement within a monastery at Liège, where he would end his days in the obscurity of religious seclusion, his kingdom extinguished, and his ambitions brought to nothing. The conquest of the Lombard kingdom, accomplished before the walls of Pavia had fully fallen, was accompanied by an event of profound significance for the future of Charles and for the relationship between the Frankish crown and the papacy. For during the course of the Italian campaign, the king had travelled to Rome to visit the city that stood at the spiritual centre of the Latin Christian world. Charles entered Rome for the first time in the month of April, in the year 774, arriving on the Saturday before Easter, and he was received by the Roman clergy and people with a ceremony of elaborate and calculated magnificence, greeted by processions of young boys who carried branches of palm and olive in token of welcome and honour. Upon reaching the great Basilica of St. Peter, the king performed an act of ostentatious humility and piety, dismounting from his horse and ascending the steps of the basilica upon his knees, kissing each of the steps in turn as he climbed toward the shrine of the Apostle, a gesture that combined genuine religious devotion with a shrewd and deliberate display of political theatre, calculated to demonstrate his reverence for the Church and his fitness to serve as its protector. During his sojourn in Rome, Charles reaffirmed the great grant of territory to the papacy that his father Pepin had made before him, the arrangement known as the Donation of Pepin, by which the Frankish crown had guaranteed to the Bishop of Rome the possession of extensive lands in central Italy, and by this reaffirmation he cemented the alliance between the Frankish monarchy and the papacy upon foundations that would endure and that would in time raise him to a dignity that neither he nor the Pope could yet fully foresee. The victory over the Lombards transformed Charles from a Frankish king into a ruler whose dominion extended across the Alps and into the Italian peninsula, and he marked his triumph by assuming the crown of the vanquished kingdom, styling himself King of the Lombards and taking to himself the ancient symbol of Lombard royalty. The crown with which he invested himself was in all likelihood the celebrated Iron Crown, so called for the narrow band of iron set within its circle of gold and jewels, a relic whose sacred associations lent to its wearer the sanction of a venerable tradition of Italian kingship. By this act, Charles joined to his Frankish dominion the whole of the Lombard realm, uniting under a single ruler the two most powerful states of the Latin West, and establishing himself as the dominant force in the affairs of Italy. The elimination of the Lombard kingdom also removed the sanctuary that had sheltered his dispossessed nephews, extinguishing the threat that Gerberga and her sons had posed to his authority, though the ultimate fate of those children has passed into the silence of the historical record. The completion of the Italian conquest in the summer of 774 left Charles master of a realm vastly enlarged and immeasurably strengthened, bound ever more closely to the papacy, whose protection he had undertaken, and free at last to direct his energies toward the northern and eastern frontiers, where a far longer and far bloodier struggle awaited him, among the pagan peoples of the Saxon forests. The struggle that awaited Charles among the pagan peoples of the north would prove the longest, the most stubborn, and the most brutal undertaking of his entire reign, a war that consumed the better part of 3 decades, and that revealed, more starkly than any other episode in his career, the fusion of conquest and faith that animated the Carolingian enterprise. The Saxons, who inhabited the vast expanse of forest and marshland between the River Rhine and the River Elbe, were a people wholly unlike the Franks in the organization of their society and in the character of their devotion, and it was precisely this difference that rendered their subjugation so protracted and so bloody. Where the Frankish realm had grown into a centralized state governed by a single anointed king, whose authority descended through his officials into the provinces, the Saxons possessed no king at all, no single figure in whose person the destiny of the people might be gathered and against whom a decisive blow might be struck. They were instead a confederation of extended families and regional clans, divided among the great territorial groupings of the Westphalians, the Eastphalians, and the Angrarians, together with the Nordalbingians who dwelt beyond the lower reaches of the Elbe, and this decentralization meant that the defeat of one region, or the submission of one chieftain, accomplished nothing toward the pacification of the whole, for there was no throne to capture, and no crown to seize that might have transferred the loyalty of the entire nation into Frankish hands. The Saxons clung with fierce and ancestral tenacity to the worship of their old gods, offering their devotions in sacred groves and before sacred springs, and upon the pillars they held holy, and their paganism was not merely a matter of private belief, but the very foundation of their communal identity, and the guarantor of their freedom from the encroaching power of the Christian Franks. To accept baptism was, in the understanding of the Saxons, to accept submission, for the faith of the conqueror came bound together with the authority of the conqueror, and the sprinkling of water and the renunciation of the ancestral gods signified nothing less than the surrender of independence and the acknowledgement of Frankish overlordship. This inseparable linkage of religion and dominion lay at the heart of the tragedy that would unfold across the forests and marshes of the north, for the Saxons fought not only for their lands and their liberty, but for their gods, and they resisted with the desperation of a people who understood that defeat would mean the annihilation of everything that had made them what they were. The war between Charles and the Saxons was therefore never destined to be a single campaign concluded by a single victory. but rather a grinding and repetitive cycle in which Frankish armies penetrated the Saxon territories, extracted submission and baptism from the defeated, and withdrew, only for the Saxons to rise again the moment the pressure of Frankish arms was lifted, burning the churches, expelling the missionaries, and returning to the worship of the old gods with a vengeance sharpened by the humiliation of enforced conversion. The opening act of this long and terrible drama took place in the year 772, when Charles led his forces into Saxon territory in what began as an expedition of the traditional kind, a punitive foray across a contested and troublesome frontier, but which soon revealed itself as something of an altogether different and more ambitious character. The Frankish army advanced upon the fortress of Eresburg and took it, establishing a foothold within the Saxon lands, and it was in the course of this campaign that Charles committed the act that announced to the Saxons and to the world the transformation of the conflict from a war of borders into a war for territory and for souls. Not far from the captured fortress there stood the Irminsul, the sacred pillar that occupied the spiritual centre of Saxon paganism, an object of the deepest veneration among the peoples of the north, described by the monk Rudolf of Fulda in later years as a vertically upright trunk of no small size, raised toward the heavens and honoured as the support and sustainer of the universe itself. The Irminsul was to the Saxons what the shrine of the Apostle had been to the Christians who greeted Charles at Rome, the material embodiment of their reverence and the focus of their communal worship, and its treasury had accumulated the offerings of generations who had brought their devotions to the sacred column. Charles ordered its destruction, and the great pillar that the Saxons believed upheld the very order of creation was thrown down, and its treasure of gold and silver carried away into Frankish hands, an act of calculated desecration that struck at the deepest foundations of Saxon identity and proclaimed with unmistakable clarity that the Frankish king intended not merely to punish and to plunder, but to extinguish the old religion and to plant in its place the faith of Rome. The destruction of the Irminsul set in motion the pattern that would define the whole tragic course of the Saxon wars, a pattern of Frankish military victory followed by mass baptisms of the vanquished, followed in turn by Saxon revolt and by savage Frankish retaliation, repeated over and over across the years and the decades until the spirit of Saxon resistance was at last broken by the sheer weight of Frankish arms and by measures of a severity that would stain the reputation of the Christian king for all the centuries that followed. The ruthlessness of the policy pursued in these years found expression in the words of a contemporary poet who captured with chilling economy the logic that governed the Frankish approach to the pagan north, observing that those who could not be persuaded to accept the faith by the gentle arts of persuasion would simply have to be forced to accept it by the sterner instrument of fear. In this brutal formulation lay the whole moral character of the enterprise, the readiness to employ terror in the service of salvation, the conviction that the fear of Frankish swords might accomplish what the preaching of the gospel could not, and the willingness of a king who styled himself the protector of the church to advance the cause of that church through massacre and forced conversion. The Saxon wars would test this conviction to its uttermost limits, and they would demonstrate that no measure of cruelty, however extreme, could quickly quench the determination of a people who fought for their gods and for their freedom. While the northern frontier consumed the energies of the Frankish state in this long and inconclusive struggle, the ambitions of Charles turned in the year 778 toward a distant and unfamiliar theatre of war, drawing him across the Pyrenees into the Iberian Peninsula in an expedition that would end in the rarest and most humiliating of failures. The occasion for this venture was furnished by the internal divisions of the Muslim powers who ruled the greater part of Spain, for a group of rebel emirs, chafing under the authority of the Umayyad emir of Córdoba, had appealed to the Frankish king to intervene on their behalf against their overlord, and Charles, whose grandfather Charles Martel had turned back the tide of Umayyad advance at Tours a generation before, saw in the invitation an opportunity to extend Frankish influence southward across the mountains and to win an easy and glorious conquest. The hope of such an easy conquest, as the historian Alessandro Barbero has observed, was without doubt the main driving force of the expedition, for Charles was drawn southward by the prospect of gain and glory as much as by any calculation of strategy or any concern for the fortunes of his supposed allies among the rebel emirs. The Frankish army advanced into Spain in 2 columns, converging upon the great city of Zaragoza, which stood upon the river Ebro and which the rebel emirs had promised to deliver into Frankish hands. But the reality that met Charles before the walls of the city bore no resemblance to the easy triumph he had anticipated. The governor of Zaragoza, far from throwing open his gates to the Frankish deliverer, refused to surrender the city, and Charles found himself compelled to undertake a siege for which he possessed neither the resources nor the time. His army encamped before walls that would not fall, and his campaign stalled in a foreign land far from the sources of his strength. As the siege dragged on without prospect of success, there came reports from the north that the Saxons had risen once more in rebellion, threatening the frontier that Charles had laboured to secure and demanding his immediate return. And confronted by the twin realities of a failed siege in Spain and a resurgent revolt at home, the king made the only decision that circumstances permitted and ordered the withdrawal of his army back across the Pyrenees toward the safety of Frankish territory. The retreat from Zaragoza was in itself a bitter admission of failure, a rare confession that the ambitions of the Frankish king had exceeded his grasp, and that the hope of easy conquest had proved a delusion. But it was in the course of the withdrawal that Charles committed an act of aggression that would transform failure into disaster. As the Frankish army made its way northward toward the mountains, it passed the Christian city of Pamplona, and Charles, whether from calculation or from the frustration of a thwarted campaign, ordered the razing of the city's walls, an act that inflicted grievous injury upon a Christian population and that inflamed the fury of the Basque peoples who inhabited the rugged country of the Western Pyrenees. The consequences of this provocation were visited upon the Frankish army in the narrow and treacherous defiles of the mountains through which it was compelled to pass on its journey home. On the 15th day of August in the year 778, as the long column of the Frankish host wound its way through the Roncevaux Pass, threading the constricted spaces between the high and rocky slopes, the Basque fighters who had gathered in the heights above launched a sudden and devastating ambush upon the rearguard of the army. The vulnerable body of men who marched at the tail of the column separated from the main force and burdened with the baggage of the retreating host. The attackers exploited to the utmost the advantages that the terrain conferred upon them, falling upon the Franks from the heights with a swiftness and a ferocity that gave the encumbered soldiers no opportunity to form their ranks or to bring their strength to bear, trapping them within the narrow pass where their numbers and their discipline availed them nothing against an enemy who struck from above and who knew every fold and crevice of the mountains. The rearguard was annihilated, cut down to the last man in the confined and bloody defile, and the Basque attackers, having accomplished their vengeance, vanished into the mountains as swiftly as they had descended, melting away among the peaks and leaving the Frankish king to contemplate the wreckage of a campaign that had begun in the expectation of easy triumph and had ended in slaughter. Among the dead who lay in the Roncevaux Pass was a Frankish nobleman named Roland, who held the office of prefect of the Breton March, a march warden charged with the defence of the frontier that faced the Breton peoples of the northwest, and his death in the mountains, together with the loss of other high officials of the Frankish court, was noted in the sober records of the age as a grievous blow to the king and to his household. Einhard, in his account of the life of Charles, made brief mention of the loss of these distinguished men who perished in the ambush, recording the disaster with the restraint proper to a chronicler who had no wish to dwell upon the failures of his hero. And in the contemporary accounts the death of Roland occupied no larger place than the deaths of the other officials who fell beside him in the pass. It was only in the passage of the centuries that followed that the obscure margrave who died at Roncevaux was raised into the towering figure of legend, for in the 11th century there arose the great epic poem known as the Song of Roland, which transformed the historical skirmish with the Basque mountaineers into a mighty clash of civilizations between Christian and Muslim, magnifying the fallen prefect into a paragon of chivalric virtue, and recasting the ambush of the rearguard as a heroic and tragic last stand against overwhelming numbers of pagan foes. The gulf between the modest reality recorded by the annalists and the soaring grandeur of the legend that grew from it stands as a measure of the power of memory and myth to reshape the events of history. But the disaster in the Pyrenees, stripped of its later embellishments, retains its own significance as one of the rare occasions on which the relentless conqueror was forced to confront the limits of his own power. The defeat at Roncevaux revealed a king who was not invincible, whose ambitions could exceed his capacity, and whose calculations could miscarry, and it humanized the figure of the tireless warrior by demonstrating that even the greatest of the Frankish monarchs remained subject to the reverses of fortune and the fallibility that no measure of power could wholly overcome. The Saxon revolt that had summoned Charles from the walls of Zaragoza was but one episode in the endless cycle of rebellion and repression that continued to consume the northern frontier through the years that followed. And as the war ground onward, the resistance of the Saxons found at last a leader capable of gathering the scattered energies of the divided clans into a single and formidable force. This leader was Widukind, a Westphalian nobleman who emerged in these years as the soul and the symbol of Saxon defiance, a chieftain who refused to submit to the Frankish yoke, and who fled beyond the Elbe to the courts of the Danes whenever the pressure of Frankish arms grew too great to withstand, only to return again and again to rekindle the flames of rebellion among his people. Under the leadership of Widukind, the scattered resistance of the Saxons acquired a coherence and a persistence it had previously lacked, and the year 782 witnessed the eruption of a major uprising that struck at the Frankish position in the north with a violence that shook the confidence of the conqueror and that provoked a retaliation of unexampled savagery. The Saxon forces, gathering in the country of the Suntel Hills, confronted a Frankish army that had been dispatched to suppress the revolt, and in the engagement that followed, the Saxons achieved a stunning and total victory, annihilating the Frankish force and killing in the course of the battle two of the chief lieutenants of Charles together with a number of noblemen who had accompanied the expedition. The destruction of a Frankish army and the death of its commanders represented a catastrophe of the first order, a humiliation that struck at the prestige of the king, and that could not be suffered to pass without an answer, proportioned to the magnitude of the disaster. The answer that Charles delivered was one of the most terrible acts of his entire reign, an act that would forever complicate the image of the Christian king, and that confronts every account of his life with a moral reckoning it cannot evade. Marching northward with the fury of a monarch whose armies had been destroyed and whose lieutenants had been slain, Charles came to the town of Verden upon the river Aller, near the place where its waters mingled with those of the Weser, and there he demanded of the Saxons the surrender of those responsible for the revolt and for the destruction of his army. According to the royal Frankish annals, the official record maintained by the servants of the Frankish court, the Saxons delivered up to the king the men whom they held to be the evildoers responsible for the uprising, some 4,500 of them, and having received these captives into his power, Charles ordered their execution, commanding that the whole multitude be put to death in a single day. The annals record with the flat and terrible brevity of an official chronicle that this sentence was carried out, that 4,500 of the Saxons were delivered up to the king, and that the sentence of death was executed upon them, the men beheaded in a mass slaughter that has come down through the centuries as the Massacre of Verden, the darkest and most notorious episode in the long history of the Saxon wars. Some modern historians have questioned the accuracy of the number recorded by the annals, suggesting that the figure of 4,500 may represent an exaggeration on the part of the chroniclers, or that the account may reflect a misinterpretation of a mass deportation rather than a mass execution, and the true dimensions of the atrocity cannot now be recovered with certainty from the meagre and partial records that survive. Yet whatever the precise number of those who perished, the essential character of the event is beyond dispute, for the annals maintained by the king's own servants record without shame or apology that Charles ordered the deaths of thousands of captives in retaliation for the revolt, and the memory of Verden stands as a monument to the readiness of the Frankish king to answer resistance with terror. The massacre at Verdun was not an isolated eruption of vengeful cruelty, but the expression of a considered and codified policy. For in the years that followed, Charles gave to his terror the sanction of law through the promulgation of the harsh legislation known as the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae, a body of ordinances issued around the year 785 that regulated the government of the conquered Saxon territories and that enforced the new religion with the ultimate penalty of death. The Capitulatio mandated the sentence of death for those who refused to accept baptism, for those who continued to practice the rites of the pagan religion, and for those who desecrated the churches that the Franks had established in the Saxon lands, translating into the cold language of statute the brutal principle that the poet had expressed, that those who would not be won to the faith by persuasion must be compelled to it by fear. The historian Pierre Richer gave to this legislation the memorable and damning designation of a terra capitulary, capturing in that phrase the essential character of a body of law that sought to accomplish the conversion of a people through the machinery of judicial death. And the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae remains one of the most disturbing documents to issue from the Carolingian court, a testament to the fusion of gospel and sword that defined the Frankish enterprise in the north. Here lay the central tension that runs through the whole of the story, the profound contradiction of a king who presented himself to the world as the devoted protector of the church and the champion of the Christian faith, and who yet enforced that faith through massacre and through the threat of execution, holding out to the Saxons the choice between the baptismal font and the executioner's blade. The severity of the measures pursued at Verdun and codified in the Capitulatio did not immediately break the resistance of the Saxons, but the relentless application of Frankish military pressure, sustained across the years with a persistence that no rebellion could exhaust, gradually wore down the capacity of the northern people to maintain their defiance. The chieftain Widukind, who had led the Great Revolt of 782 and who had become the living embodiment of Saxon resistance, continued for a time to sustain the struggle, but the weight of Frankish arms and the futility of continued opposition at last brought even this most obdurate of leaders to submission, and in the year 785 Widukind laid down his resistance and accepted the baptism that signified his acknowledgement of Frankish overlordship and his abandonment of the old gods for whom he had fought so long. The submission and baptism of Widukind marked a significant turning in the long war, removing from the Saxon cause the leader who had given it coherence and inspiration. Yet even the conversion of so formidable an adversary did not bring the conflict to its end, for the Saxons were a people without a single head, and the submission of one chieftain, however prominent, could not bind the loyalty of the whole nation. The uprisings would continue in the years that followed the baptism of Widukind, flaring anew across the forests and marshes as fresh generations rose to renew the struggle their fathers had waged. And the completion of the pacification of Saxony would require measures still more drastic, and a patience still more unwearied on the part of the Frankish king, who had resolved that the pagan north should be brought, whatever the cost in blood and in years, into the fold of the Frankish realm and the Christian faith. The ceremony that received Widukind into the Christian community took place at the royal residence of Attigny, a Frankish palace far removed from the forests, where the chieftain had waged his long defiance, and the choice of setting carried a symbolism as deliberate as every other element of the occasion. The Saxon leader who had for years eluded the armies of the Franks now stood within a Carolingian hall, surrounded by the apparatus of the court he had resisted, and submitted himself to the waters of baptism in an act that fused the spiritual and the political into a single indivisible gesture. Charles himself stood as godfather to the man who had been his most formidable adversary in the north, and this sponsorship transformed the relationship between conqueror and conquered into something modelled upon the bonds of Christian kinship, for the godfather assumed a spiritual responsibility for the godson and bound him within a network of obligation that the Frankish court understood as no less binding than any oath of fealty. The elevation of Widukind from rebel to spiritual son of the king represented the calculated deployment of religious ceremony in the service of statecraft, an attempt to draw the most dangerous of the Saxon leaders into the fold, not merely as a defeated enemy, but as a member of the Christian family over which Charles presided, and the gifts and honours that accompanied the baptism sought to bind Widukind to his new allegiance through the ties of reward as well as the ties of faith. The submission of Widukind at Attigny in the year 785 did not, as the events of the following years would demonstrate, extinguish the embers of Saxon resistance, for the decentralised character of the northern people meant that no single leader could deliver the loyalty of the whole nation, and the uprising continued to flare across the marshes and forests as new generations of Saxon warriors took up the struggle their predecessors had waged. Yet the removal of Widukind from the ranks of the resistance deprived the Saxon cause of the figure who had given it coherence and continuity, and the relentless application of Frankish pressure, sustained across decades with a persistence that no revolt could exhaust, gradually diminished the capacity of the Saxons to sustain their defiance. The completion of the pacification would require still further campaigns and still further deportations, the systematic removal of Saxon populations from their homelands, and their resettlement in territories where they might be more easily controlled, and this policy of enforced displacement, pursued alongside the settlement of Frankish and Slavic populations within the conquered lands, sought to break the connection between the Saxon people and the soil that had nourished their resistance. The Saxon lands were divided into administrative units, endowed with churches and with the beginnings of an ecclesiastical structure, and drawn slowly into the framework of Frankish governance through the same mechanisms that Charles employed throughout his expanding realm. The pattern of consolidation that Charles pursued in Saxony found a parallel and a contrast in the manner by which he brought the Duchy of Bavaria under his direct control, for here the instrument was not the prolonged application of military force, but the swift and calculated deployment of legal process and political pressure against a rival whose autonomy had long troubled the Frankish court. The Duchy of Bavaria had been governed for generations by the Agilolfing dynasty, a princely house that acknowledged a nominal subordination to the Frankish crown, while maintaining in practice a substantial independence of action, and the last of this ancient line was Duke Tassilo III, a ruler whose long tenure and whose connections to the Lombard house had made him an object of persistent suspicion within the councils of the Carolingian regime. Tassilo had bound himself to Charles through oaths of fealty on more than one occasion, submitting formally to the overlordship of the Frankish king, yet the Duke had continued to pursue a policy that preserved as much of his autonomy as circumstances would permit, and his marriage to a daughter of the deposed Lombard king Desiderius had linked him to the fallen dynasty whose destruction Charles had accomplished and whose partisans he continued to regard with wariness. The reckoning between Charles and Tassilo came in the year 788, when the Duke was summoned before a great assembly convened at the royal palace of Ingelheim, and there confronted with the accumulated charges that the Frankish court had assembled against him. The accusations that were brought against Tassilo centred upon the ancient and grievous offence of broken faith, the violation of the oaths he had sworn to his overlord, and upon the still more damaging charge that he had entered into hostile contact with the Avars, the pagan people of the eastern steppe whom the Franks regarded as their enemies, and whose alliance against a Christian king constituted a betrayal of the gravest character. The charge of desertion in the face of the enemy, an offence that in the Frankish military tradition carried the harshest of penalties, was levelled against the Duke, and the assembly of Frankish magnates, gathered under the presiding authority of the king, pronounced against Tassilo a sentence of death that Charles, in a display of the clemency that served his purposes better than execution, commuted to the sentence of forced entry into monastic life. Tassilo was compelled to receive the tonsure that marked the monk, the shearing of the hair that signified the abandonment of the secular world and the renunciation of all claim to temporal power, and the last duke of the Agilolfing line was confined within the walls of a monastery, where he would end his days in the enforced contemplation of a religious vocation he had never sought. The deposition of Tassilo and his confinement to the cloister brought to an end the long autonomy of Bavaria, and delivered the duchy into the direct administration of the Frankish crown, extinguishing one of the last of the great regional powers that had preserved a measure of independence within the sphere of Frankish influence. The absorption of Bavaria added to the realm of Charles a substantial and prosperous territory, one whose position upon the eastern frontier of the Frankish world would make it the springboard for the campaigns against the Avars that lay ahead, and the manner by which the duchy had been acquired demonstrated the sophistication of the political instruments that Charles now commanded. The deployment of the assembly and the accusation and the legal sentence in the service of an expansion that required no siege and no prolonged campaign. The fate of Tassilo, stripped of his dignity and immured within a monastery, served as a warning to any who might contemplate the preservation of an autonomy that the Frankish crown had resolved to eliminate, and the extinction of the Agilolfing dynasty removed from the political landscape a house whose antiquity and whose independence had made it a standing challenge to the centralizing ambitions of the Carolingian regime. The governance of a realm that now stretched from the Rhine to the heart of Italy, and from the Saxon marches to the Pyrenees, presented to Charles a challenge of administration that no Frankish king before him had confronted. For the sheer extent and diversity of the territories under his authority defied the capacity of any single ruler to supervise them through personal presence alone. The solution that Charles developed to this problem of scale drew upon the traditional institutions of Frankish government, while transforming them into instruments of a more systematic and centralized control, and at the heart of this apparatus stood the counts, the royal officials to whom Charles delegated the administration of the local districts into which the realm was divided. The count governed his territory as the representative of the king, exercising judicial authority and military command and the collection of the royal revenues, and the appointment of counts throughout the expanding realm allowed Charles to project his authority into regions that his own person could never regularly visit. Yet the delegation of power to local officials carried within it the perennial danger that the agents of the crown might come to serve their own interests rather than those of their master, accumulating within their districts a local authority that could rival and resist the central power, and Charles addressed this danger through the development of an institution that gave to his governance its most distinctive and enduring character. The institution that Charles employed to supervise the counts and to maintain the integrity of his administration across the vast reaches of the realm was the office of the Missi Dominici, the envoys of the Lord, pairs of royal inspectors dispatched throughout the territories to oversee the conduct of local government and to enforce the decrees of the crown. These missi travelled in pairs that typically combined a churchman, a bishop or an abbot, with a layman, most often a count of proven loyalty, and the pairing of ecclesiastical and secular authority within each team reflected the fusion of church and state that characterized the whole of the Carolingian enterprise. The missi were assigned to defined circuits of the realm, districts through which they travelled to hold assemblies, to hear the complaints of the people against the abuses of local officials, to ensure the administration of justice, and to verify that the capitularies and decrees issued by the royal court were being observed throughout the territories subject to Frankish rule. Through the labour of these itinerant inspectors, Charles established a channel of communication and control that bound the distant provinces to the central authority, allowing the will of the crown to be transmitted to the furthest corners of the realm and allowing the grievances of the governed to reach the ears of the king, and the office of the Missi Dominici represented one of the most sophisticated instruments of governance developed in the early medieval West. The administrative machinery that Charles constructed extended beyond the network of counts and missi to embrace the ecclesiastical structure of the realm, for the king established new bishoprics throughout the conquered territories and drew the church into the apparatus of government to a degree that made the distinction between spiritual and secular authority difficult to maintain. The bishops and abbots of the realm served not merely as the shepherds of the faithful, but as the agents of royal power, holding lands and commanding resources and exercising jurisdiction that made them essential components of the Carolingian state, and the foundation of new sees in Saxony and elsewhere along the frontiers served the dual purpose of advancing the Christian faith and extending the reach of Frankish governance. The capitularies that Charles issued, the collections of ordinances that regulated matters ranging from the administration of justice to the conduct of the clergy, to the management of the royal estates, testified to a conception of kingship that embraced the ordering of society in its every dimension, and the promulgation of these decrees through the assemblies of the realm and their enforcement through the labour of the missi transformed the person of the king into the source of a comprehensive body of law. The biographer Einhard, in the account he composed of the life of his royal master, recorded the essential character of a ruler who combined the pursuit of conquest with the labour of administration, describing Charles as a great statesman and a great conqueror, and the conjunction of these two qualities within a single figure captured the transformation of the Frankish king from a mere war leader into the architect of a centralised empire that stitched together a fractured and diverse landscape into a cohesive whole. The eastern frontier of the realm that Charles had assembled brought the Frankish world into contact with the Avars, the nomadic people of the steppe who had established their dominion over the Pannonian basin, the broad plain drained by the Danube and its tributaries that lay beyond the newly acquired territory of Bavaria. The Avars had descended upon Central Europe from the grasslands of the east in the century that preceded the reign of Charles, a mounted people whose military prowess and whose ferocity had made them the terror of their neighbours and the recipients of tribute from the empire of the Byzantines, and across the generations of their ascendancy they had accumulated within their dominions a treasure of extraordinary magnitude, the hoarded plunder of their raids and the tribute exacted from the peoples they had subdued. At the centre of the Avar dominion lay the great fortified stronghold that the Frankish sources called the Ring, a defensive complex whose character the accounts of the period described in terms that combined the historical with the legendary, speaking of concentric walls and earthworks of formidable extent within which the Avar rulers had gathered the accumulated wealth of their long depredations. The descriptions of the Ring as a structure of 9 concentric walls of stone belong perhaps to the realm of legend, or represent a symbolic magnification of what may have been in reality a complex system of earthen fortifications. Yet whatever the precise character of its defences, the Ring served as the heart of the Avar power, and the repository of the treasure that had made the Avars an object of both fear and envy among the peoples who bordered their dominion. The conflict between the Franks and the Avars opened after the failure of negotiations conducted in the year 790, and in the year that followed Charles launched a major invasion of the Avar territories, leading his forces into the Pannonian basin in an enterprise that aimed at the destruction of the steppe power and the seizure of the wealth it had accumulated. The initial progress of the campaign was hampered by an epidemic that struck the horses of the Frankish army, an affliction that decimated the mounts upon which the mobility of the forces depended and that constrained the ambitions of the first year's operations. Yet the war that Charles had commenced would be pursued across a span of years that carried it toward a conclusion favourable to the Frankish cause. The turning of the conflict in favour of the Franks owed much to the internal dissolution of the Avar power, for the Saganate was riven by civil strife that pitted rival factions against one another and that sapped the capacity of the Avars to present a united resistance to the Frankish advance, and the disintegration of the steppe polity from within accomplished what the arms of the Franks alone might have struggled to achieve. The prosecution of the war fell in substantial measure to the lieutenants whom Charles entrusted with the command of the eastern campaigns, among them his son Pippin, who governed the kingdom of Italy, and Duke Eric of Friuli, whose leadership of the forces upon the frontier contributed to the mounting pressure that the Franks brought to bear upon the crumbling Avar dominion. The culmination of the long struggle came in the years 795 and 796, when the Frankish forces, aided by the Slav leader Wojnomir, whose knowledge and whose alliance facilitated the advance, breached the defences of the Great Ring and laid their hands upon the treasure that the Avars had gathered across the generations of their ascendancy. The plunder that fell to the Franks upon the capture of the Ring exceeded in magnitude anything that the previous campaigns of Charles had yielded, and the biographer Einhard, recording the event in the life he composed of his royal master, declared this the most lucrative of all the campaigns that the Franks had undertaken, describing the gold and the silver and the accumulated wealth of the steppe that was hauled back to Francia by the wagon load. The treasure of the Avars, the hoarded plunder of a nomadic empire that had terrorized Central Europe for a century and more, passed into the possession of the Frankish king and transformed the material foundations of his power, providing a windfall of such magnitude that its effects would be felt throughout the realm and would finance ambitions that the ordinary revenues of the kingdom could never have supported. The wealth that flowed into Francia from the shattered Avar dominion funded the construction of churches and rewarded the followers whose service Charles wished to bind more firmly to his cause, and above all it financed the cultural ambitions that were taking shape at the court of the king, providing the material means by which Charles would raise at the heart of his realm a monument to his power and his piety. The wealth that the Avar treasure poured into the coffers of the king found its most enduring expression in the transformation of the palace at Aachen into the centre of a cultural revival that would give to the reign of Charles its most lasting achievement, the movement that later ages would name the Carolingian Renaissance. At the heart of this revival stood the Palatine Chapel, the great church that Charles raised beside his palace, and that embodied in stone and in the arrangement of its spaces the ambition to establish in the north a second Rome, a Christian capital that would rival in its magnificence the ancient centres of the faith. The construction of the chapel, begun around the year 792 and brought to its consecration in the year 805, proceeded under the direction of the architect Odo of Metz, whose design gave to the church an octagonal and domed form modelled upon the church of San Vitale in the Italian city of Ravenna, a building whose Byzantine grandeur Charles had beheld and whose form he sought to reproduce within his own domain. The Palatine Chapel rose as the physical manifestation of the aspiration that animated the whole of the Carolingian cultural enterprise, the desire to gather within the Frankish realm the inheritance of the classical and Christian past, and to make of Aachen a centre of learning and of faith worthy to stand beside the great cities of antiquity. The intellectual heart of the revival that gathered at Aachen was the school established within the palace, and the direction of this enterprise fell to the Anglo-Saxon scholar Alcuin of York, a churchman whose learning had made him one of the most distinguished figures of his age and whom Charles invited to his court in the year 781 to preside over the education of the realm. Alcuin, born in the north of Britain around the year 732 and trained in the cathedral school of York that preserved the learning of the insular tradition, brought to the Frankish court a mastery of the disciplines that the schools of the early medieval West had inherited from the classical past, and he organised the intellectual labour of the palace around the systematic study of the 7 liberal arts, the trivium of grammar and rhetoric and logic, and the quadrivium of arithmetic and geometry and music and astronomy. Under the direction of Alcuin, the scholars of the court undertook the correction of the biblical and liturgical texts that had suffered corruption through generations of careless copying, restoring to the scriptures and to the books of the Church a fidelity that the reform of the faith demanded, and the labour of textual correction became one of the central preoccupations of the Carolingian revival. The era over which Alcuin presided witnessed the development and the standardization of a new form of writing, the clear and uniform script that later ages would name the Carolingian minuscule, a hand whose legibility and whose regularity made the copying of texts more accurate and their reading more certain, and this script, spreading from the scriptoria of the Frankish realm across the whole of the Latin West, would become the ancestor from which the lowercase letters of the modern Roman alphabet descend. The king who presided over this revival of learning and who raised the great chapel at Aachen remained in his person a figure of striking contradiction, a warlord whose life had been spent in the prosecution of relentless campaigns, and who yet cherished the life of the mind and lavished upon the pursuit of learning the resources and the attention of his court. The biographer Einhard, who knew the king in the years of his maturity, and who composed the account by which later ages would come to know him, recorded the simple and traditional habits that Charles preserved amid the grandeur of his imperial estate, describing a ruler who clad himself in the dress of his Frankish forefathers, the linen shirts and the tunics bordered with silk and the blue cloak, and who adopted the dress of the Romans only upon the express request of the popes whom he wished to honour. The private life of the king was marked by a complexity that the ceremonies of his court could not conceal, for Charles took multiple wives across the course of his long life and maintained besides a number of concubines, fathering by these unions at least 18 children whose presence filled the palace at Aachen with the life of a numerous family. Among these children, the daughters held a place of particular affection in the heart of their father, and Charles displayed toward them a possessiveness that led him to refuse them in marriage, keeping them close about his person and denying to them the husbands that their rank might have commanded, a policy that served the political purpose of preventing the emergence of ambitious sons-in-law, while satisfying the personal desire of a father who, as Einhard recorded, could not bear to be parted from their company. The intensity of this domestic attachment, the closeness of the family that Charles gathered about him within the walls of his northern capital, stood in a striking contrast to the iron will that the king displayed in the public exercise of his power, and the paradox of the tender father and the relentless conqueror captured the double nature of a ruler who governed his realm with severity and who cherished his children with an affection that no consideration of policy could restrain. The vision that animated the labour of the court at Aachen extended beyond the accumulation of manuscripts and the raising of chapels to embrace a conception of learning as a divine gift, an instrument essential to the moral health of a Christian realm and to the salvation of the souls entrusted to the care of the king. Charles regarded the cultivation of learning not as an ornament of his estate, but as a duty imposed upon a Christian ruler, for the correct understanding of the Scriptures and the proper conduct of the liturgy required a literate clergy and accurate texts, and the reform of the faith that Charles pursued throughout his realm demanded the revival of the learning that had decayed through the disorders of the preceding centuries. The dream that took shape at Aachen was the dream of a renewed Christian Rome, not the Rome of temporal dominion alone, but a Rome of the mind, a restoration of the classical and Christian inheritance that would make of the Frankish realm the guardian of a civilization the collapse of the ancient order had endangered, and the warlord who had shed the blood of Verden and who had shattered the dominion of the Avars devoted the wealth of his conquest to the raising of this monument of learning and faith. The paradox of the enterprise, the fusion of the sword and the book within the ambitions of a single ruler, defined the achievement of Charles in these years of his maturity, and the court that learning built at Aachen stood as the enduring expression of a vision that sought to make of the Frankish realm the seat of a new order in which the arms of the conqueror served the purposes of the Christian faith, and the treasure of the vanquished financed the revival of the human mind. The vision that had taken shape within the walls of Aachen, this fusion of temporal dominion and spiritual authority that made of the Frankish realm a guardian of the Christian inheritance, would find its ultimate expression not in the raising of a chapel or the copying of a manuscript, but in a crisis that erupted in the streets of Rome, and that would compel Charles to assume a dignity that no ruler of the West had claimed for more than 3 centuries. The event that set in motion the transformation of the Frankish king into a Roman emperor began on the 25th day of April in the year 799, when Pope Leo III, the successor to that Hadrian whose friendship Charles had cherished across the decades of their alliance, processed through the streets of the city during the observance of the Greater Litanies, the ancient rogation ceremony in which the clergy of Rome traversed the sacred routes of the city in supplication for the harvest and the health of the people. The procession, an event that gathered the ecclesiastical dignity of Rome into a solemn public display, became the setting for an ambush that had been prepared by the enemies of the Pope, a faction of the Roman aristocracy incited by the relatives and supporters of the deceased Hadrian, who regarded Leo as an upstart of common origin, unworthy of the chair of St. Peter, and who resented the elevation of a man who lacked the noble lineage that the great Roman families considered essential to the dignity of the papal office. The assailants who fell upon Leo during the procession intended not merely to depose him, but to render him permanently incapable of holding the office to which he had been elected, for they sought to blind him and to cut out his tongue, mutilations calculated to disqualify him from the papal dignity according to the understanding of the age, which held that a bishop must possess the physical integrity of his senses and the faculty of speech required for the celebration of the liturgy and the governance of the Church. the violence inflicted upon the person of the Pope in the streets of his own city, the attempt to maim and to silence the successor of the Apostle by the hands of Roman citizens, represented an outrage that shocked the sensibilities of the age and that demonstrated the depth of the divisions that afflicted the Roman aristocracy in the aftermath of Hadrian's death. Leo, according to the accounts that survive, escaped the full measure of the mutilation that his enemies intended, whether through the intervention of Providence that his supporters proclaimed, or through the assistance of 2 envoys of Charles who happened to be present in the city, and who aided the injured Pope in his flight from his tormentors. The Pope, having narrowly preserved the faculties that his attackers had sought to destroy, resolved to place himself under the protection of the one power in the Western world capable of restoring him to his office and of chastising the enemies who had assaulted the dignity of St. Peter, and Leo undertook the long journey northward across the Alps to throw himself upon the mercy and the protection of the Frankish king. The arrival of the fugitive Pope at the court of Charles, which the king had established for the season at Paderborn in the heart of the Saxon lands that his campaigns had subdued, presented the Frankish ruler with a dilemma of extraordinary delicacy, a problem that touched upon the deepest principles of canon law and the most sensitive questions of the relationship between the temporal and the spiritual authorities of the Christian world. The enemies of Leo had accused the Pope of grave offences, charging him with perjury and with adultery, and the resolution of these accusations posed a difficulty that no precedent could readily resolve. For the settled doctrine of the Church held that no earthly power possessed the authority to sit in judgment upon the successor of St. Peter, that the Pope, as the supreme bishop and the head of the visible Church, stood beyond the reach of any tribunal that mortal men might convene. Alcuin of York, the scholar whom Charles had gathered to his court and whose counsel the king valued in matters that touched upon the intersection of faith and governance, expressed the principle in words that captured the constitutional impasse that the crisis had created, declaring that no power on earth could judge the Pope, that the vicar of the Apostle answered to God alone and to no human authority however exalted. The problem that confronted Charles required him to restore Leo to his office and to punish the criminals who had assaulted him, and to accomplish these ends without appearing to exercise over the Pope and over the city of Rome a jurisdiction that the theory of the Church forbade, without seeming to reduce the successor of St. Peter to the status of a subject amenable to the discipline of a Frankish king. The path that Charles chose through this thicket of legal and theological difficulty revealed the caution and the political skill that characterized his handling of the most sensitive matters of his reign, and the king determined that he would proceed to Rome in person to restore the state of the Church, to investigate the accusations against Leo, and to arrange a resolution that would satisfy the demands of justice without violating the principle that placed the Pope beyond human judgment. Charles dispatched Leo back to Rome under the protection of an armed escort, restoring the Pope provisionally to his see while the graver questions of the accusations awaited the king's own arrival, and throughout the year that followed the Frankish court deliberated upon the manner in which the crisis might be resolved to the honour of the papacy and to the security of the Frankish alliance. In November of the year 800, Charles arrived in Rome, entering the city that had crowned his father a patrician, and that had received him as its protector on the occasion of his first visit a quarter of a century before, and the king convened in the following month a council of the ecclesiastical and secular dignitaries of the realm to consider the affairs of the Church and the accusations that hung over the head of the Pope. The assembly that gathered under the presidency of the king could not, according to the principle that Alcuin had articulated, pronounce judgment upon the Pope, and the resolution that emerged from the deliberations of the council preserved the doctrine of papal immunity through a device that satisfied the demands of justice without asserting a jurisdiction that the Church denied. On the 23rd day of December in the year 800, before the assembled dignitaries of the Church and the realm, Leo ascended the pulpit of St. Peter's and solemnly purged himself of the accusations that his enemies had brought against him, swearing upon the Gospels an oath of his innocence, declaring before God and before the assembled multitude that he was guiltless of the crimes of perjury and adultery of which his accusers had charged him. The purgation by oath, the voluntary declaration of innocence sworn by the Pope himself, rather than a verdict imposed by any tribunal, preserved the principle that no earthly power could judge the successor of St. Peter, for Leo submitted not to the judgment of the council, but to the judgment of God, clearing himself by his own solemn affirmation and thereby restoring the dignity of his office without conceding that any mortal authority possessed the right to try him. The resolution satisfied the demands of the crisis, restoring Leo to the full exercise of his office, chastising the enemies who had assaulted him, and preserving intact the doctrine of papal immunity that the Church regarded as fundamental to the constitution of the Christian world, and the manner in which the Pope had cleared himself, purging the accusations by his own oath rather than by any external verdict, left the Pope indebted to the Frankish king, whose presence and whose authority had made the resolution possible, and whose protection had preserved the papacy from the violence of its enemies. 2 days after the Pope had purged himself of the charges against him, on the 25th day of December in the year 800, the feast of the Nativity of Christ, Charles attended the celebration of Mass within the ancient Basilica of St. Peter, the church that Constantine had raised over the tomb of the Apostle nearly 5 centuries before, and as the king rose from the prayer in which he had knelt before the confession of St. Peter, Leo approached him and placed upon his head a crown, and the assembled multitude of the Romans acclaimed him with the ancient formula of imperial acclamation, crying out that to Charles, the most pious Augustus crowned by God, the great and peace-giving emperor, be life and victory. The words that the Roman people proclaimed within the basilica, the acclamation that hailed Charles as Augustus and as emperor, revived a dignity that had been extinguished in the West since the deposition of the last Roman emperor of the West, more than 3 centuries before, and the placing of the crown upon the head of the Frankish king by the hands of the successor of St. Peter, fused into a single person the military power of the Franks, the tradition of the Roman imperial office, and the sanction of the Christian Church. The ceremony that unfolded within the Basilica of St. Peter on that Christmas morning represented the culmination of the long ascent of the Carolingian house, the elevation of the descendants of the mayors of the palace to a dignity that surpassed the royal titles that Charles already bore, and the coronation transformed the king of the Franks and the Lombards into an emperor whose authority claimed continuity with the Caesars of antiquity, and whose office united the temporal and the spiritual ambitions of the age. The account that Einhard recorded of the coronation, composed in the years after the death of the emperor by the scholar who had known Charles intimately and who had served at his court, introduced into the history of the event a claim that has occupied historians across the centuries that followed. For the biographer asserted that Charles was so ignorant of the intention of the Pope that he declared afterward that he would not have entered the church that day, although it was a great feast if he could have foreseen the design of Leo. The famous assertion that the emperor had been surprised by his own coronation, that the placing of the crown upon his head had occurred without his knowledge or his consent, has divided the judgment of historians who have weighed the plausibility of the claim against the improbability that so momentous a ceremony could have been prepared and executed without the knowledge of the ruler whom it elevated to the imperial dignity. Many scholars have argued that the coronation represented the culmination of a carefully negotiated arrangement between the Frankish court and the papacy, a design deliberated across the year that separated the resolution of the crisis of Leo from the ceremony of the Nativity, a plan in which the surprise recorded by Einhard served the purpose of concealing the calculation that had produced the event and of presenting the coronation as an act of divine and papal initiative rather than of Frankish ambition. Others have maintained that the initiative belonged to Leo alone, that the Pope seized upon the occasion of the king's presence in Rome to bind the Frankish ruler to the defence of the Church through the bestowal of an imperial dignity that the papacy claimed the right to confer, a unilateral manoeuvre that presented Charles with a title he could not refuse without insulting the Pope, whom he had restored, and the Roman people who had acclaimed him. The reservation that Einhard attributed to the emperor, whatever its foundation in the sentiments of Charles, may have reflected the delicate diplomatic complications that the assumption of the imperial title created, rather than a genuine ignorance of the ceremony that elevated him, for the coronation posed grave problems in the relationship between the Frankish realm and the empire that ruled from Constantinople, the Eastern Roman state that regarded itself as the sole and legitimate continuation of the Roman imperial tradition. The emperors who ruled at Constantinople, the heirs of the Roman dominion that had endured in the East through the centuries during which the West had fragmented into barbarian kingdoms, viewed themselves as the only true Roman emperors and regarded with hostility the assumption by a Frankish king of a dignity that they considered theirs alone, and the coronation of Charles as Emperor of the Romans constituted, in the eyes of Constantinople, a usurpation that challenged the legitimacy of the Eastern state, and that created two claimants to a title that the theory of the Roman world held to be indivisible. The circumstance that a woman, the Empress Irene, occupied the imperial throne at Constantinople in the year 800, having deposed and blinded her own son to seize the government of the Eastern Empire, may have furnished the Pope and the Frankish court with a justification for the coronation, an argument that the imperial office stood vacant because no man held it, and that the elevation of Charles filled a throne that the irregular succession at Constantinople had left without a legitimate occupant. The consequences of the coronation extended far beyond the resolution of the crisis that had brought Charles to Rome, for the ceremony of the Nativity of the year 800 fundamentally reshaped the order of the Western world and created a new imperial identity that would define the political constitution of Europe for 1,000 years. The assumption of the imperial title by the Frankish king shifted the centre of political gravity in the Christian world from Constantinople to the west, establishing in the person of Charles a rival to the emperor who ruled from the ancient capital of the East, and asserting that the Roman imperial tradition had passed to the Frankish realm that guarded the Christian faith and that protected the successor of St. Peter. The fusion of Frankish military power with the Roman imperial tradition and the Christian religious authority, embodied in the crown that Leo had placed upon the head of Charles, gave birth to a conception of empire that would endure through the centuries that followed. The notion of a Christian empire of the West that united the temporal dominion of a great ruler with the spiritual mission of the Church, and that claimed continuity with the vanished glory of ancient Rome. The diplomatic complications that the coronation created between the Frankish realm and the Empire of the East occupied the final years of the reign of Charles, for the emperors who ruled at Constantinople refused for more than a decade to acknowledge the imperial dignity of the Frankish ruler, regarding his title as a usurpation that diminished their own claim to the sole inheritance of the Roman name. Charles pursued through the years that followed his coronation a persistent diplomatic effort to secure from Constantinople the recognition of his imperial title, an effort complicated by the hostility of the Eastern court and by the disputes over territory and jurisdiction that divided the two empires along the frontiers where their interests met in Italy and in the Adriatic. The resolution of the long dispute arrived in the year 812, when the Byzantine Emperor Michael I, confronted by the pressures that afflicted the Eastern state and desirous of securing his position through an accommodation with the powerful ruler of the West, grudgingly recognized the imperial title of Charles, according to the Frankish emperor, the acknowledgement that the East had withheld for more than a decade. The recognition that Constantinople extended fell short of a full acknowledgement of the claims that the coronation had asserted, for the Byzantine court acknowledged Charles as emperor, while declining to concede to him the title of Emperor of the Romans, reserving to their own state the unique inheritance of the Roman name, and conceding to the Frankish ruler only the imperial dignity, without the specific claim to the Roman succession that they regarded as theirs alone. The compromise that the recognition of 812 embodied, the acknowledgement of Charles as an emperor without the concession of the Roman title, ended the open hostilities that the coronation had provoked and established a diplomatic accommodation between the two empires, a settlement that recognized the reality of the imperial power that Charles had assumed while preserving the theoretical claims that Constantinople maintained to the sole succession of ancient Rome. The administration of the vast empire that Charles governed in the years of his imperial dignity continued to occupy the energies of a ruler who, though advanced in age and diminished in the vigour that had carried him through the campaigns of his earlier decades, retained the will to govern that had characterised his long reign. The court at Aachen remained the centre of the scholarly revival that the wealth of the conquest had financed, and the labour of the reform of the liturgy, the standardisation of the canon law, and the correction of the text of the faith proceeded under the direction of the scholars whom Charles had gathered, continuing the work that would preserve for the ages that followed the classical and Christian inheritance that the disorders of the preceding centuries had endangered. The reforms that Charles pursued in these years extended to the administration of justice, the coinage of the realm, the organisation of the church, and the governance of the vast territories that his conquest had assembled, and the emperor laboured to impose upon his dominions a uniformity of law and of faith that would bind the diverse peoples of his empire into a coherent Christian order. The advancing years of the emperor and the deaths of the sons whom Charles had designated to succeed him compelled the ageing ruler to consider the arrangements for the continuation of his empire beyond the term of his own life, and the succession that had once promised to divide the realm among several heirs according to the Frankish custom of partible inheritance had been simplified by the deaths that had removed all of the legitimate sons of Charles save one. In the year 813, sensing the approach of his own end, Charles took the deliberate and momentous step of associating his only surviving legitimate son, Louis, whom later ages would call the Pious, in the imperial dignity, crowning him co-emperor within the Palatine Chapel at Aachen, that the architect Odo of Metz had raised in imitation of the churches of Ravenna. The ceremony by which Charles elevated Louis to the imperial office differed in a significant respect from the coronation that Leo had performed at Rome 13 years before, for the ageing emperor crowned his son with his own hands within the chapel of his northern capital, bypassing the ceremony at Rome and the intervention of the Pope, asserting through this arrangement the autonomy of the Frankish imperial power and the principle that the Emperor of the West derived his dignity not from the bestowal of the papacy, but from the will of his imperial predecessor and the sanction of God. The coronation of Louis at Aachen, performed by the hands of his father without the participation of the Pope, expressed the Frankish conception of the imperial office and secured the succession of the empire to the surviving son of Charles, providing for the continuation of the dominion that the emperor had assembled through the labours of his long reign. Charles the Great died at Aachen on the 28th day of January in the year 814, in the 72nd year of his life, having ruled the Franks for more than 4 decades, and having borne the imperial dignity for 13 years, and the emperor who had governed the greatest realm that the West had known since the fall of ancient Rome was laid to rest within the Palatine Chapel that he had raised as the monument of his vision, buried in the church where he had crowned his son, and where the treasure of his conquest had financed the revival of the Christian and classical learning that he had cherished. The emperor who had preserved amid the grandeur of his estate the simple habits of his Frankish forefathers, who had disdained the foreign garments however beautiful and would never consent to wear them, who had cherished his daughters with an affection that no consideration of policy could restrain, and who had ruled his vast dominions with a will of iron, passed from the world he had transformed into the memory of the ages that would claim his legend for their own. The name that the Latin tongue bestowed upon him, Carolus Magnus, Charles the Great, entered the languages of Europe as Charlemagne, and the empire that he had raised through the fusion of the sword and the book, of Frankish power and Roman tradition and Christian faith, became the template of the imperial ambition that would animate the rulers of the West for 1,000 years. As kings and emperors invoked his legend to claim the mantle of a unified and Christian Europe that his coronation had brought into being, Charles the Great had forged from the wreckage of the ancient world a new imperial order that combined the ruthless will of a Frankish conqueror with the reverence of a Christian ruler for the learning and the faith that the collapse of Rome had endangered, creating both the enduring template of a European empire that successive rulers would invoke across the centuries to legitimize their own ambitions and the legend of a Christian Augustus whose shadow would loom over the politics of the West for 1,000 years, a monument raised in the fusion of blood and prayer that would define the identity of a continent long after the emperor himself had passed into the silence of his tomb at Aachen.